There we go.
All right, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Ben Price, and we're here to talk about a book I wrote, How Wealth Rules the World. And the subtitle is Saving Our Communities and Freedoms from the Dictatorship of Property. This is part two, which actually starts with chapter one. Last month, we covered the introduction. And one of the main principles or principal ideas that we covered in that introduction makes a distinction between types of property and how they're treated under US law. And the terms are personal property and privileged property. And there's a specific meaning of privileged property that will become more and more important and apparent as we go through the rest of the book. And what I'll do, just turning to the introduction, and just to give a sense of personal property, what do I mean by that term? And then we'll move on into tonight's discussion of chapter one. But under personal property, as used in the book, it's derived from one's own labor. So ownership of personal property is understandably a cherished right. Our homes and vehicles, our wages and savings, but I don't include in that returns on savings derived from interest, for instance, but earned property, earned wages and so forth. And so when we think about, do you have a right to your property? We'll be diving into that a little bit more this evening to kind of parse it out. And I'm going to make the comment that, and actually the title of chapter one is, property is not an unalienable right. And all kinds of property, personal property and privileged property. Now, what do I mean by privileged property? Privileged property is the kind of property to which the Federalists, that's the folks who wrote the US Constitution, the Federalist Party, and later their quasi-monarchical Supreme Court attached legal privileges, the kind of property that is not earned by personal effort. Either it is the spoils of conquest, the booty of pillaging, or the result of the enclosures, in other words, privatization of the commons, or it is ownership of amassed property through inheritance, purchase, garnishment, or confiscation. So it's a kind of, it's what we refer to as wealth. It is above and beyond what has been earned by personal effort, and that can be physical, mental effort, whatever kind of effort it might be, artistic effort, for instance. So that's the general sense of what I'm talking about, making the distinction between private property and privileged property. Now, this chapter one is titled, again, Property is Not an Unalienable Right. In the US, that comment is not going to meet with a lot of acceptance, because in the United States, a great deal, as a matter of fact, I would argue that the bulk of our laws actually have to do with property and rights attached to property in various ways. And another thing about this book is that I'm going to be looking at what the Federalists did when they drafted our US Constitution and attached privileges and governing authority and other powers to certain types of property, privileged property. We'll be getting into that. Who were these Federalists, and how dare I question those founding fathers and what they did to create a constitution for all of us to live in the land of the free, the home of the brave, where everyone is equal, regardless of any other qualifications, that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. That's what we're told. And I seem to be saying something different, that in fact, we're not all born, we're all born equal, but we don't stay much equal after that. And so let me start by saying a little bit about history. because the book really does dive into US history particularly. And because understanding where our American laws come from and where the laws that pertain to what we can accomplish in our own communities, in our municipalities, in our counties. And so much of our work has been dealing with people in local communities concerned about various projects that were being proposed and opposed by the community. But when the community tries to say no to those projects, from everything from fracking to toxic landfills to developments that change the quality of the community, to aerial spraying of pesticides, you know, we can make a litany of all the things that people don't want to happen in their communities. But in order for us to understand the difficulty we have in saying no to things that we understand are going to cause damage to us, perhaps make us ill, our children ill, destroy our local ecosystems. When it comes to trying to say no to those things, we find that the law isn't necessarily on our side. It doesn't recognize the primacy of our authority to protect our communities. The primacy is somewhere else. And what I'm arguing in this book is that the bias of the law is in favor of accumulation of more and more wealth. And if that's what you're about, you're more likely to find the law favoring you and your priorities than if you don't have that wealth, if you're not exercising privileges attached to that wealth. Now, when I say these things, it seems controversial to folks who, like me, by the way, I was born in Philadelphia, and I learned all about the American Revolution and the wonders of the founding fathers and the legends of the revolution and all of those things. But history is an interesting thing. And just to say that every generation encounters a past into which it did not participate, and it has no proof that it ever existed as described. I mean, when we're born, all we've got to go on is what people report to us about what happened before we landed on planet Earth. And we call it history when the story of the past is retold anew. That's history to us. Whether that past is made up of false memories or amnesia, the living generation has to decide, or unwisely, in my view, simply accept the past as delivered by historians and well-meaning teachers. And so in his book, I want to mention an interesting book to me. In his book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, Haitian author Michel Rolfe-Trolliot wrote this: "We are never as steeped in history as when we pretend not to be. But if we stop pretending, we may gain in understanding what we lose in false innocence. Naivete is often an excuse for those who exercise power. For those upon whom that power is exerted, naivete is always a mistake. History," I'm quoting still, "history is the fruit of power, but power itself is never so transparent that its analysis becomes superfluous. The ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility, the ultimate challenge, the exposition of its roots." And frankly, that is what my motivation was to put this book together. It's certainly not what occurred to me when I first began to do this community rights work and rights of nature work. I didn't realize that I would be confronted I would be actually confronting a history that had been handed to me and described to me, that as I dug in to really understand the root of our powerlessness in our communities to protect our children and our land base, that history had been falsified. And that's something that you don't expect. For me, it seemed a betrayal. Why would I go to school for years and hear stories that then I had to uncover. It's sort of like discovering there is no Santa Claus. You know, you're a child and you're raised and you're told all these great stories. No tooth fairy either. No Easter bunny. What the hell? You know, and not only that, but the founding fathers. Hell, from what I know now, I want a blood test. You're going to tell me they're the founding fathers. I need to check this out. Philosopher Slavoj Zizek, as another way of putting it, than the Haitian historian that I quoted earlier. He said, I despise the kind of book that tells you how to live, how to make yourself happy. Philosophers have no good news for you on this level. I believe the first duty of philosophy is making you understand what deep shit you're in. Well, it's not the politest way to put it, but in some ways, it is the way that I approached writing this book, because it's about trying to let people know that you've been scammed. I've been scammed. And the only way seemingly out of this mess is to come to an understanding of not just that we have been fooled and deceived, but what are the tools that have been used? I mean, to me, that was what my mind was curious about. How was it done? How does the magician do that trick? How does power stay invisible in plain sight? That seemed important for me to understand if I was going to be able to answer the questions of community members who said, how can they get away with this? How come we can't stop them? And that's the simple, pragmatic reason for me diving into all of this history and law. And I think that it has helped me understand the way things work. And I think that it's helped me to answer people's questions a little bit more clearly. Well, I'll be honest, it's been made very complex. Lawyers do those things and lawmakers make things complicated. And that's part of how power hides in plain sight, how it remains invisible. Because we can't even believe that they would be this manipulative. So it's not just recent historians and philosophers who had doubts about what the Federalist Party did when they wrote the US Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, who was an anti-federalist, he was not in favor of adopting the proposed Constitution that Hamilton and John Adams and others were strongly in favor of, the Federalists. When it came to meeting in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, Jefferson was shipped to France to become an ambassador to France from the new nation. Probably would have caused some indigestion had he stayed and attended the Philadelphia gatherings, the secret gatherings in Philadelphia. But here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson, a real skeptic of this system. And he said this, quote, I doubt whether a single fact known to the world will carry as clear conviction of it, of the treasonable views of the federal party, treasonable views, who having nothing in them of the feelings or principles of 76. In other words, the stuff that Thomas Paine was talking about and Sam Adams, when they talked about beginning the world anew and getting rid of aristocracy of all sorts. So having nothing in them of the feeling of the principles of 76 and the Declaration of Independence, now look to a single and splendid government of an aristocracy founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. This will be to them a next best blessing to the monarchy of their first aim. In other words, they would rather have had a monarchy than a republic. Alexander Hamilton proposed having a constitutional monarchy. That was his proposal for a constitution. And so just to finish up, Jefferson said, this will be to them, this new constitution, this new form of government, the next best blessing to the monarchy of their first aim, and perhaps the surest stepping stone to it. So they may not have succeeded in creating the monarchy that they would have preferred, because they know that the people would have revolted. They just revolted against the British. Why would they accept the new monarchy? But Thomas Jefferson is hinting that looks like maybe they've erected a system that will get them as close to it as possible. I'll leave that. That's just kind of a little bit of introductory remarks for this chapter. And now we're going to get into talking about how property is not an unalienable right. And there's a reason for beginning with that concept, because of what the Constitution, how it was written, and what it did to really magnify the importance of and elevate the power of those who held wealth, privileged property. The first subsection of the chapter is titled Devise and Conquer, the Legal Foundations of Empire. And I'm being intentional using the term empire. We're told it was a democracy that was created. And then others, when we say the democracy isn't working, say, oh, well, it was never intended as a democracy. It was intended as a republic. And then when we say, well, we're really not getting much in the way of representation, what are you going to do? Well, I guess you're just going to have to vote for better people. That's what we're given. But I'm arguing that actually what was laid down was the foundations of a continent-spanning empire, starting with 13 colonies. And I begin the chapter talking about a specific campaign in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And it has to do with a pipeline. This is the kind of work that CELDF does with communities. And I want to embody the nature of law and privileged property and all of these concepts in practical terms so you can see how they work. So there is an order of nuns, of Catholic women in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They're known as the Adorers of the Blood of Christ, and they own land in Lancaster County that the Atlantic Sunrise gas export pipeline was proposed to cut across their land. They have a title and a deed to it. And so we're going to start there. In the chapter, I talk about how the nuns said, no, we don't want the pipeline. They actually filed a lawsuit. The pipeline was something that they said would be in violation of their not only their property rights, but their religious beliefs, because they had a deep devotion to the earth and to the living planet. And what happened was that rather than wait for their lawsuit to stop the pipeline to go through and to be heard in court, the industry folks, they came in and started bulldozing, and they're just going to put the pipeline through. Now, prior to them doing so, the religious women had erected a chapel right on the spot where the pipeline would be going through. And people in the community had gathered around to support them and protest against this pipeline for their own reasons too. They did not want this pipeline coming through. And so when they began to do the bulldozing, they actually just ran the bulldozers over the sanctuary that was built in on the land out in kind of a meadow. And it was just plowed over. About a dozen, I think it was, or so protesters were taken off, arrested, and they were accused of trespassing. What do you mean trespassing? Isn't it the nuns' land? No, the land had been condemned through eminent domain. That was the eminent domain was applied for by the industry, by the corporation involved, and it was granted by the state. And what does it mean when eminent domain is exercised? It means that the state, they say, condemns, takes away land held privately and uses it. Now, technically, it means that the land will be used for a public good, for a public use. So it could be, well, we need to put a highway through here. Sorry that your farm is here, but we need to put the super highway through. Here's some money for your land. Here comes the highway. The issue with the adorers of the blood of Christ, the nuns, is that their land was not going to be used for a public use. The state granted eminent domain, took their land and gave it to a private corporation. Now, what was the corporation going to use it for? Because clearly you might argue that, oh, even if you disagree, taking natural gas out of the ground and making it available for use by households, by industry, and the rest of it is a public good. But in fact, the pipeline was being laid to the coast so that the gas could be loaded on ships and sent abroad. So so-called natural gas, methane, taken out of the ground in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where all of the people supposedly owned the resources, was taken out by a private corporation for private profit and then shipped abroad and not kept even within the borders for community use within the United States. So I just want to go through in the chapter. I talk about a couple of dynamics in this whole process of eminent domain, taking private land, handing it over to another private party, which is a corporation, the pipeline corporation. The first dynamic that I suggest needs to be noticed is that the law transferred control of the commandeered property to a private business corporation for private profit and without any public value or benefit. The second dynamic to notice is that while the rights in the property or any kind of property under US law exceed the rights inherent in people and living systems, property rights trump human rights and civil rights quite regularly in the courts. That is true. But here the law also distinguishes between wealth and mere possessions. And wealth received the land, and the mere possession of the land by the nuns was not enough right in property to protect their interest in it. The third dynamic to notice is that the law found greater value in the property rights of the owners of corporate property than the nuns' right of ownership to their land. And herein, this is where it's revealed the difference between privileged property and non-privileged property. If all property were the same in the eyes of the law, the nuns might have expected that the courts would protect their right to their land. And in general, the courts will protect your right to your land, except the law works for, well, we have to decide who the law works for and who it works against. And it can be shown that that depends on ownership of wealth. When it comes to a contest between mere private property and privileged property, what happens? Well, the fourth dynamic to notice is that the rights, this is an additional dynamic, the rights of the residents of Lancaster County, including the ones that were arrested for their protests, were irrelevant to the legal permitting of the pipeline because they had no property interest in the land. It wasn't theirs, it was the nuns, and that didn't help them either, but they had no property interest in the land. The protesters had no legal standing before the law to have their grievances heard, and therefore they had no business being there trespassing on land that had been commandeered by the state and given to a corporation. And finally, the fifth dynamic to notice is that preserving the natural world did not factor into any of the legal proceedings. Nature is not a subject in the eyes of the law. It's an object, a collection of items to be owned, and not a rights-bearing entity to be protected. It's mere property. Nature, all of nature, has only one legal status, and that is as property in the eyes of the law. So I'm going to pause there for a second and see if there is maybe a comment or a question at this point. You can raise your hand or you can type into the chat. Tam. You'll have to unmute, sorry.
That has never happened before. It's just a beautifully written piece. So all praise. It's funny and ironic and dazzling. I mean, how could you come up with something as perfect as this? And I'm waiting to learn about the corporate state conspiracy. What the hell? I mean,
how could that happen? Right?
Like,
we're going to get to it, yes. And when you say conspiracy, people get shaky about that. It's like, oh, that's just fantasy, that's just imagination. No, when people actually make plans together to create an outcome, you don't have to call it conspiracy, but it is what it is. Right? Bill.
Yeah, Ben, I just had a question about, to clarify, personal property, you said derived from one's own labor. So I assume that means things of possessions that you have, like your car, your house and things like that. What about stocks? And can stocks be one or the other, depending on if they're inherited or you purchase them with your own income?
I would say no. As I'm defining it, stocks are not personal property. They're privileged property because attached to them are certain rights that you don't get simply by working hard to make a paycheck. Stocks mean that you can actually make money by sitting on your hands and letting somebody else work. And the stock goes up because they worked so hard, they were so productive, and they didn't get paid the full value of their labor. Well, where did the rest of the money go that didn't show up in their paycheck? Went into your stocks.
So does it mean that all examples of personal property are physical, like entities, or are there examples of things that are not? I'm just trying to think.
Well, when I say that they're the result of your effort, and it doesn't have to be physical work, it can be mental work.
Okay.
And so if you write a poem, and you want to, you want it to be yours, well, that is you created it. But we'll get into it a little bit more here, but frankly, it's not so much that there's a right to that property, even the property that you worked for. It's your freedom to work without having the value of your labor benefit somebody besides you. That's where the actual right is. It has to do with your ability to work without servile labor, where you're actually benefiting somebody else by your efforts.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Thanks.
Andy, I see you have your hand up, and then we'll stop and we'll move on to the next section. Okay, Andy.
Sorry, I didn't read the thing. This sounds so fascinating. And if you are the lawyers sitting right there,
No, I'm going to demand a retraction. I'm not a lawyer.
Okay, but these are the cases that CELDF has worked with, right?
Yeah. The Lancaster County case, we didn't actually go to court over it on behalf of the nuns. They went in and they argued their case on different grounds than we might have, but we did have we were involved with staff members and so forth, helping with the organizing and the protests and so forth.
Wow.
Okay, yeah. So we're going to give more examples of the kinds of community organizing, the kinds of litigation we were involved in as we go forward. So let me go ahead and I will cover the next piece. And if we don't make it through the full chapter tonight, because there's interest in questions and so forth, my thinking is that rather than race through and pretend that we covered it, we'll stop where we stop and we'll pick up on the next session with that. If I hope that's agreeable to everyone, but I don't think that it makes much sense and I don't think you can get as much out of it as if we actually spend the time to cover things that aren't clear. So I'm going to go on to the next subsection in the chapter, and it's called Building Empire Under the Radar, because nobody wants to say that's what's going on. Building empire under the radar. And if you recall that quote from the Haitian historian that said that power likes to work invisibly, this is part what I'm talking about here. So my thesis is that the federal constitutionalism serves wealth, not people and communities or nature, because it treats ownership of personal property not as an unalienable right, but the accumulation of large amounts of property as if it is an unalienable right. Not all of us, just to say, what do we mean by unalienable rights and why isn't property? Not all of us are born equally advantaged with wealth. Unalienable rights are distributed equitably to all. That's by definition. Again, recall that unalienable means intrinsic, impossible to be separated from, not able to be forfeited, sold, traded, or even voluntarily surrendered. If it's unalienable, it's sort of like your eye color. Maybe you can put contacts in to change it, but pretend that doesn't exist. It's about unalienable rights are things we all have in common. We're born with them. That's the kind of right they talked about in the Declaration of Independence. Nobody has a right to take them from you, and you don't even have the liberty to sell them, to give them away, or to surrender them. They are yours. The law's deference to rights vested in privileged property is so integral to American constitutionalism that loss of property rights generally only happens when the rights of one party conflict with the interests of another wealthier party. So you generally don't lose your rights to property unless there's a contest between who has more of it. And then the privileges attached to privileged property kick in. In a conflict between personal property and privileged property, the law and court precedent favor privileged rights over personal rights. This is the big secret that everybody knows, but no one wants to talk about. I think we all have that sense that, man, then the gots gets, that's what my mother used to say. Nice little Irish woman. Then the gots gets, and it's kind of the rule. American law developed in a culture of colonial expansion. It intentionally protects the accumulation of privileged property or wealth. And it's no wonder in any of this, such accumulation is the engine of empire. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Why is the accumulation of more and more wealth and property the basis, the foundation on which empire is built? An unacknowledged partnership exists between government and wealth in the guise of corporate power. The legalized expropriation of personal property, including labor, when it benefits private accumulation of profit and wealth, demonstrates what much of American law is all about. And so the rights of a large corporation to treat their workers the way they want to, and to interfere with unionizing and the rest of it. We've had our ups and downs historically, but as we see, in general, the trend is for corporate power to have the upper hand in all cases. What do I mean by this? Kind of a partnership between government and private wealth in the guise of corporate power. Well, where do corporations come from? The answer is they're chartered by state governments. Where did they get all of their constitutional rights as corporate property, which is now considered a person? And the answer is from the federal court. As a matter of fact, the charters that are given to corporations are considered a contract between the people of the state and the holders of the corporate charter. a question, and I'll just raise it and let you toss and turn on it tonight, and give me a good answer when you think of it. But how is it possible, if a corporate charter is a contract between the people of the state and the incorporators, how is it possible for the federal court, the Supreme Court, to then step in and alter that contract by saying that the corporate party to this contract now has Bill of Rights protections? How is it that the federal government, a non-party to the contract, step in and alter the contract? How could that happen? I'll just leave it there. It's something to be explored at a later date. So the project of empire building is accomplished through legally sanctioned mechanisms for the appropriation of other people's property, labor, savings, and rights. The project of empire building is accomplished through legally sanctioned mechanisms for the appropriation of other people's property, labor, savings, and rights. The very first example of that kind of basis for empire building with law was the doctrine of discovery, that allowed those European nations to step in and legally take other people's land and work and savings and everything. And it was legalized. That mechanism hasn't changed. We may be using laws with different names, but those mechanisms are not that really changed. The legalized expropriation of personal property, like the nuns' property, for instance, including labor when it benefits private accumulation of profit and wealth, demonstrates what much of American law is all about. Now, posing the question, is the accumulation of property, of wealth, in other words, by legal means, not illegal, by legal means, is that an unalienable right, the right to create wealth? Again, back to what I was saying earlier, because privileged property can be increased, then the legal rights conveyed by it, by privileged property, can be increased. If those rights are unalienable, then unalienable rights can be compounded, they can be increased. If so, we'd have to conclude that some unalienable rights are not equal rights. By extension, because some people can have more unalienable rights than others, then unalienable rights could be withheld legally from the majority or from a disfavored minority. Then the whole concept of unalienable rights would be meaningless. The more rational conclusion is that unalienable rights are in fact equal for all, and that property accumulation is not an unalienable right. Over time, and under the color of law, rights vested in property, what I call rights of property, have eroded the natural rights of everyone but the propertied class. Over time, by manipulating law to privilege rights vested and attached to property, that process has eroded the natural rights, the really unalienable rights of everyone but the property class. And there's a reason. And that next heading was the Federalists had the building of a continent-spanning empire in mind. I'll go through this real quickly. They included constitutional provisions for addition of new territories and states. How many other nations in their national constitutions have provisions in there saying, well, let's leave it open for when we take over some other land and make it part of our country? The United States started out with its constitution saying exactly that. Any other constitution that had those words in them, probably we would hear extreme criticism around the globe saying, well, there is a tyranny waiting for an opportunity. The Federalists also included mechanisms to accelerate and defend minority ownership of most of the property, along with control of lawmaking and government by that same minority. And all of this is contrasted sharply with the aspirations of American revolutionaries and the expectations, even now today, of newcomers to the United States, because they've heard the same stories we heard in school about how those things would never happen in the good old United States. So let me pause there for a minute and see if there are any comments or questions. I'll take maybe one or two. Any thoughts or questions?
Actually, there's one in chat that came through. It didn't come through, I don't believe, to everyone, but I responded to everyone. So I want to pose the question so that my response makes sense. So the question was, don't corporations have to renew their charters every few years? And can't we demand they pass a test for social responsibility to renew their charter? Michael Lerner, head of the Network of Spiritual Progressives, proposed this. So my response, which everyone can read in chat, is in response to that question. So hopefully that context will it will make more sense to you. And Ben, clearly you can add to that if you'd like, or do you want me to read what I responded?
No, go ahead, read it. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so my response was, it used to be that way for a time after the Revolutionary War, because the main concern that caused the war was the relationship between corporations and government and the oppression they imposed on the people. Nowadays, you can incorporate online for a small fee in perpetuity. Such restrictions on corporations would be a better situation than we have today. However, it would not change the privileges and rights bestowed upon them by the courts. I'm sure Ben can expand upon that.
We could spend the rest of the time just on that topic. It's a good one. And we're going to come back to corporate rights, corporate privilege, all of that stuff in further chapters. But I'm sticking with the kind of the focus on property and rights attached to property, because that sure didn't seem like an obvious problem to me when I first started doing community organizing. But the more I did, and the more involved I got in with the litigation and so forth, the clearer it became to me that there was some kind of a problem. There was some kind of a bias in the law itself, that it wouldn't let justice be done. And the judges could say, my hands are tied. I am obliged to maintain, stare decisis, to make sure that what went before is upheld. But of course, all that means is that the law it's sort of like a self-sealing tire. You get punctured and it seals itself up. So if the existing status quo is challenged, the law, based on the past decisions of the courts, the courts are again required to maintain the status quo. So how do we create better law? How do we make forward motion in the cause of justice? And the answer is not easily. So back to property, though, because we're laying the groundwork here a little bit. And the next subheading in the chapter is titled Lines in the Sand. Property is ink on paper. So let's ask ourselves the most basic question: where does property come from? And so I'll ask you to consider this. From outer space, they send the rockets up and the astronauts take pictures of the Earth, they look back, or the weather satellites, whatever. So from space, from orbit, it's not possible to see national borders or property lines on Earth's surface. That blue-green globe up there, that Earth, it's beautiful, but it doesn't look at all like a Rand McNally kind of an atlas or a municipal plat or anything like that. State and town boundaries are invisible. Property lines are undetectable. So if property in land and political borders can't be seen empirically, in the real world, where do they exist? And the answer is they exist only in law, so ink on paper, and in the minds of people who believe law reflects reality. You cannot identify a property line anywhere but, in the documents and in the beliefs of those who think that the documents describe reality. As if to insist that property created by blending land with law is real society refers to it as real estate. It's interesting, like you almost have to convince yourself, no, it's real. We're going to call it real estate. To illustrate how this real property becomes real in our heads, and that's the only place it becomes real, besides the guns of the cops who stop you from taking what they say isn't yours. Let me tell you a brief story about the colonization of the Western Hemisphere by Europeans. Okay, so Christopher Columbus and his ships sail to the Western Hemisphere, and they sail around and they map the coasts, and they're fascinated by a whole new place they didn't even know existed on the planet. And they go back to Europe. First place they land is in Portugal, and they approach the king of Portugal and they say, look what we found. Here's our maps. It's a lot of land. I'll bet they got all kinds of wealth and resources. There are people there, but boy, they're a pushover. They don't have guns. And the king said, that's just wonderful. Portugal claims all of it for ours. And that was how eminent domain was exercised back then. And eminent domain actually is originally a term of war, which means confiscating your enemy's land. But unfortunately, Christopher Columbus probably opened his mouth unwisely. And that because when he went to Spain and he met up with the monarchs of Spain and described the same things, they said, that's really great, Chris. Spain claims it all for Spain. Now we have Portugal and Spain at odds. They're both Catholic nations with Catholic monarchs. And who's going to settle the dispute? Well, the papacy, the Pope. And what happens there? Well, the dispute was settled by Pope Alexander VI. Anybody ever watched, there was a program on one of those series called The Borgias? I mean, I know I haven't watched television in a decade or two, but it was, so when I did, I saw that it was Alexander VI, Pope Alexander VI, that whole series centered around. But anyway, Alexander VI, he took the map and he drew a line, pretty crude map. He drew a line from the North Pole to the South Pole on that map. And what he said was, to the east of the line, where present-day Brazil juts out into kind of the Atlantic Ocean, that he declared would be Portuguese, ruled by Portugal. And to the west of that line would be ruled by Spain. So with a simple line from pole to pole, that line became a property line, a law, in fact, a law, ink on paper. That where did the division of the Western Hemisphere between Portugal and Spain come from? A line of ink on a crude map. The Pope's pen was as powerful as a magic wand, if you think about it. The spell he cast over history was slow to take hold, of course, but the ink on the map changed the course of world events. That ink had the indelible effect of creating a rule of property that opened the way for invading conquistadors. What's the rule of property? Well, we have an old law dictionary that defines it as a rule of law affecting the ownership or transfer of property. The term is ordinarily used in connection with rules established by judicial decision, in this case, the Pope, it being a general principle of law that decisions which have become rules of property, that is, under which property rights have been acquired, will not be overruled, though erroneous. Even if that decision was made erroneously, that property claim should not be challenged. Well, what does that rule of property preserve? It preserves injustice. What for and in favor of who? In favor of the wealthy person or the wealthy monarch who gets to claim it. So, meanwhile, it left the indigenous people by the millions and the whole of the natural world in the Western Hemisphere rightless and without protection. The doctrine of discovery, which comes from this whole idea espoused by Pope Alexander VI and his predecessor or his following popes. In his letter, it was actually a papal bull called In Terra Cetera of 1493. It legalized conquest, plunder, exploitation, in fact, genocide, ecocide, and lots of other barbarous kinds of behavior. I'll pause there for a quick question or comment, if anybody has anything. Nope. Okay, so next, justifying injustice. This is the next subheading. Justifying injustice, the emperor's philosophers. Where do we get all the great ideas that everything that's happened in the Americas has been for the best? 33 years after the Pope penned his papal bull of 1493, 33 years later, Francis Bacon published Novum Organum, laying out the basis for scientific inquiry. He imagined human beings could escape the limitations nature imposed on us by deducing its laws from observation. Okay, so I mean, I started out studying the sciences. I thought Francis Bacon was just a magnificent philosopher genius. He knew that we had to change the way we approach the world, and we were going to entice all of the secrets of nature from nature so that we could then do things like make, I don't know, internal combustion engines and artificial intelligence, or whatever you want to think of. So where Pope Alexander VI drew a line and made a law that severed the physical world into parts and parcels, property in other words, Francis Bacon intended to dissect all of nature, to own its secrets and use those laws to similarly enrich whoever could command those laws of nature. Bacon is quoted this way, quote, "My only earthly wish is to stretch the deplorably narrow limits of man's dominion over the universe to their promised bounds. Nature will be bound into service, hounded in her wanderings, and put on the rack and tortured for her secrets." The rituals of, that was end quote, the rituals of mechanical intervention into nature, like the Pope's ritual dividing up the planet into estates, made world-spanning conquest possible. Bacon also is purported to have said, quote, "I am come in very truth, leading you to nature with all her children, to bind her to your service and make her your slave. The mechanical inventions of recent years do not merely exert a gentle guidance over nature's courses, they have the power to conquer and subdue her, to shake her to her foundations." And these comments kind of summarize the imperial spirit of the age, although they're generally confused with the rationale for scientific inquiry. And what I also find interesting, much to my chagrin, is that when we talk with who should be our natural allies, progressive environmentalists, who insist on, we need to collect more data, we need more facts, we need more measurements, we need to take precautionary measurements of the drinkability of the water before they start the fracking. We got to have facts, we got to have data. They're essentially defending Francis Bacon's method, and certainly Francis Bacon and his plan to enslave nature, torture nature for her secrets, and use those secrets to have dominion over not only nature, but the rest of humanity. Is that really the kinds of the precedents, the kinds of foundational ideas that people supposedly want to protect the natural world should be aligned with? Now, I understand that we've gained a lot of information and knowledge from studying in the scientific method. But, the world's been reduced to a matrix of possessions in terms of property lines, held together by a tangle of laws defining who owns what and who owns not. denigration of so-called primitive societies for existing at a subsistence level with no aspirations for material enrichment went viral as the empire of capital extended its reach into every human habitat on the planet. As indigenous people were being pushed aside to access so-called resources coveted for extraction and profitable manufacture and trade, a complicit public whose members had already been absorbed by empire and their traditional cultures digested by similar but forgotten means, are assured that so-called development will save those primitive folk from their supposedly sad existence. A mythological ethics devised to rationalize depriving societies living symbiotically with nature of their traditions professes to champion philanthropic goals of converting those people to productivity and a better standard of living. The few not slaughtered for resisting are condemned to lives of servitude to the economy, in other words, labor extraction, of their conquerors, that is, the economy of their conquerors, in exchange for what? Lives of marginal subsistence in t-shirts manufactured by similarly shackled communities in far-off lands. Bacon's extraction of mechanical rules from nature has severed humanity from nature's community. The privatization of nature and other societies became the obsession of a culture experimenting with altering its place in the world. Dominion has supplanted interdependence. Now, many today predict a terrible endgame when the laws of nature and human laws clash. I think that we hear an awful lot about that these days with the climate crisis and with the sixth great extinction and with the disappearance of island nations under the sea and all kinds of other dire consequences. And so we have learned how to master the rules, the laws of nature. And we've learned how to divide the globe up into parcels that some privileged folks get to own. What we haven't done is imposed any wisdom on what to do with those special rights and privileges. Apparently, being able to take advantage of the planet endlessly is something that, against all evidence, people still believe in. So, in the age of conquest, it was law as much as gunpowder that helped Europeans conquer whole continents, including, again, from the doctrine of discovery on down. The law of boundaries, borders, enclosures, and property, armed with the distilled and lifeless laws of nature, had a hypnotic effect on European culture. A whole civilization was blinded to the horror and harm it would do to believe in that system. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in the second volume of his work, and again, another philosopher, kind of an apologist for the building of European empire, but he had this to say in his second volume of his work on inequality. He said, quote, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You're undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" So it's not as though there wasn't any thinking going on at the time that the justifications for European empire were being devised. We call them the Enlightenment philosophers. But to me, it seems that that would be akin to referring to Fox News as the Enlightenment philosophers of our time, because it's about justifying injustice. That's the philosophy that's being put together here. Another philosopher of the era, John Locke, wrote this, quote, "Government has no other end but the preservation of property." Government has no other end but the preservation of property. Now, that wasn't the case until John Locke said so. But it caught on because it justified conquest, empire, imperialism. American revolutionaries like Thomas Paine, when he wrote Common Sense, and Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, had other aspirations. For them, the purpose of government was not the preservation of property, it was securing unalienable rights, including the right to one's own labor and the product of it, and the right of the people to engage in self-government without deference through the priorities of wealth. But in America and in the nations around the globe whose social contract is rooted in conquest and colonialism, the ethics of power and possession prevailed, and not the ethics of the true American revolutionaries. So we'll move on to the next piece if there aren't any quick comments or questions. And that is workers and the law serve wealth. Looks like we're going to be running out of time here, isn't it? I guess this is going a little bit longer. Maybe, what do we think? Do we want to have a conversation here, pause, and we'll pick up from here in the next section, or shall I push forward?
Well, Karen has her hand up, so.
Okay, Karen?
Well, maybe we do want to move on. I was just curious as to, weren't there others that were backing the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson? I mean, weren't there other voices objecting to what was going on by the Federalists?
Absolutely. They were called the Anti-Federalists. And we don't hear about them in our history lessons very frequently. But the Anti-Federalists numerically were in the majority at the time that the proposed Constitution was being circulated to the state conventions that were to review. The delegates from the state legislatures were to review this proposed new Constitution and vote on it. The Anti-Federalists, the ones who said, no, this is a horrible idea, this will centralize power, it will strip the states, which are right now independent nations, and they're involved in this confederacy with each other of mutual protection and aid under the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want to do it. And so, yeah, there were plenty of people who said, no, this is the wrong way to go. And folks, including Thomas Jefferson. Now, the fact is, yes, he eventually became third president of the US, and he eventually helped expand the empire by the Louisiana Purchase, doubled the size of it. So, of course, we've all heard the notion that, once you come into wealth and power, you're going to be corrupted. Is that what happened to Jefferson? I don't know. I can't say what was going on in his mind, but we know what he did, right? But yes, there were those who opposed it. Now, I'm just going to here's a quote speaking of who else might have been on the side of the Anti-Federalists. Under workers and the law served wealth, Benjamin Franklin, corresponding with the wealthiest man in the American colonies, the financier of the Revolution, Robert Morris, wrote this to Mr. Morris, quote, all the property that is necessary to a man for the conservation of the individual and the propagation of the species is his natural right, which none can justly deprive him of. But all property superfluous to such purposes is the property of the public, who by their laws have created it, and who may therefore by other laws dispose of it whenever the welfare of the public shall demand such a disposition. I've been saying that property doesn't exist anywhere but in law and in the minds of those who believe it. This is Ben Franklin saying, that's right, all property is, it's the community that acknowledges the ownership of property. Otherwise, everything is communally owned. You can't have someone owning something specially theirs unless the community says, okay, that's fair, that makes sense. Especially the, personal property that are required for survival. Those things, Franklin says, clearly they belong to the individual because other rights depend on it. The right to life depends on those things. So let's be clear about, privileged property and where it comes from, as opposed to where the right to one's personal property comes from. In all cases, law creates property. We aren't born with it. Well, you can inherit it, but you weren't born with it. It isn't yours without that piece of paper saying you inherited it. Whether it's the nun's land or in their chapel in the woods, or the pipeline company's commandeered right of way through their sanctuary, law and government decide who owns what. That goes for all kinds of property. Okay. And again, we're going to be referring to personal and privileged property further on. I did mention that the reason that personal property has rights attached to it isn't that it's property. It's that otherwise the fruit of your efforts, if they were owned by someone else, you would in fact be indentured, or you would be a slave. If your labor benefits someone else involuntarily, then that would be a deprivation, not of property so much, but of your freedom. And so we did go through a period of time when human beings were considered property. We had slavery, and it was constitutional. And there were rules in Congress against even speaking, any Congress members speaking about slavery on the floor of the House. It was forbidden. Why? Because we're not going to question that. It's settled law. Yes, Africans can be slaves, they can be property, and no, they don't have any rights. And yes, we can count them to increase our representation in Congress and in choosing the president. And that's what we call, by the way, privileged property. Enslaved Africans were a type of privileged property. How is that? This is a strong example of privileged property. The authority to be represented in Congress was decided based on proportional representation. So what is the population of your state? We'll take that number and we add them all to all the other states, and then we decide here's how many people we're going to have in Congress. We divide it up, and you get a proportional number of representatives to your population. But what happened under the 3/5 clause that the Federalists put into the U.S. Constitution is that they counted enslaved Africans as 3/5 of a human being. That didn't mean they had 3/5 of the rights of a person. That means that when it came to the census and counting how many people lived in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, the other slave states, that enslaved human beings would be counted as 3/5 of a person in the census, thus padding the amount of representation slave states got in the House of Representatives, and also in the Electoral College that chooses the US president. And that, by the way, is still how presidents are chosen. And it is, again, by proportional representation, population-based of your state. Attaching the extra authority of slave owners to have more representation in the House of Representation, attaching that governing power to enslaved people, property in the eyes of the law. That's what I mean by privileged property. The enslaved people certainly didn't enjoy any kind of privilege, any kind of extra rights. It was their owners to whom those privileges devolved. So this is, again, the case with corporations. How can we say that a corporation, corporate property, a piece of paper, in fact, a charter, How can we say that this corporate charter has Bill of Rights protections? Well, the court has said so. And that piece of paper supposedly has those rights. How does that piece of paper enjoy those rights? Well, it doesn't. A piece of paper can't enjoy rights. But the people who invest in and own the corporation can. And they gain when they already have Bill of Rights protections as individual human beings. They already have certain unalienable rights. But their corporate charter, the charter attached to the property they hold in common with each other, has an extra scoop of constitutional protections attached to it. And those extra protections are enjoyed not by the piece of paper, but by the investors. And one of the privileges they get is that they're not liable for damage that the corporation does to the communities where they act. Well, they don't act. It's where the corporations are used on behalf of their investors and their owners to act. And when things go wrong and when harm is done, the people who actually benefit from those extra rights and those extra privileges are not liable for the harm, because the corporate property is itself a person in the eyes of the law, and therefore the corporate person is responsible, not the owners. Keep that in mind next time you want to talk with somebody about artificial intelligence and whether robots walking around that seem like human beings with their intelligence, who's going to actually gain rights. By the way, Saudi Arabia has already recognized an artificial intelligence, a robot named Sophia. They've recognized it as a legal person in Saudi Arabia. Now, who gets those rights? Compare it to the enslaved human being in the US. Certainly not the enslaved person, and certainly not the machine called Sophia. There are no rights to be enjoyed by a machine. It is the owners of the machine who get to say, we didn't know that our machine was going to cause this disaster, but it's not our problem and we're not responsible because Sophia is her own person in the eyes of the law. That's how corporations work now. They're robots. And the people who own them aren't responsible for what the robots do. So when Dr. Frankenstein makes his monster, no legal liability there at all. Because Frankenstein's monster is his own person. The corporations are their own person. The AI machine is its own person, if recognized as such under the law. Privileged property is like that, and the 3/5 clause is a strong example of it. And when we get into chapter 2, I'm going to give a few more examples that'll hopefully crystallize this idea of privileged property. It isn't just that you're richer and can do more, because I'm not criticizing at all the fact that somebody who has more than I do can enjoy more leisure and more luxury. You know, knock your socks off, enjoy it, glad to hear it, and have fun with your wealth. More leisure and luxury doesn't do me harm. But when you use your leisure and luxury to have a stronger voice in government than the rest of the community, now we're talking about privileged property, because privileged property is about attaching governing authority to wealth. And we know from Citizens United how that's been done, how corporations can be used to control lawmaking and elections. We can see how that's happened. And there are other means as well. Looks like we're about out of time here, and I'm not going to go over time on this, but that means that we are not actually to the very end of chapter 1. If you'll indulge me, I will stop at this point and pick up again, and we'll just start over with Benjamin Franklin and his comments about the right to own personal property, and how all property is created by law, and the community can deprive the owner at any time if it is for the public good. There's a lot more to say about all of that, and the three-fifths clause and the rest. Let me stop now. We are at 8:30, and I'll just ask before we wrap up if there are any comments and questions at this point that can be answered within a reasonable amount of time. And then I just want to close by reminding you of a couple of things here.
I think that there's a quick question that you could respond to, Ben, that was shared in chat. Why use the term privileged property rather than privileged men?
Because I think that that's a good question, but I think that it's the property itself and it's the diversion. I guess what I'm trying to do is expose the diversion. It's sort of a sleight of hand. So when somebody's doing a magic trick with a coin in their hands or cards or whatever, if your life depends on the outcome of the game, you want to know what they're doing and how they're doing it. And that's more the case with privileged property than it is with a card game, unless you've bet your savings on it. But privileged property, I'm trying to point out, it's a repository. It's sort of like a vessel, a cup, if you will. And you fill the privileges in the cup. The cup doesn't get to drink itself. The owner of the cup gets to drink. And so that's kind of the property isn't privileged. It is the bearer of the privilege. It is the vessel of the privilege. And it's not something that has been revealed to us in our history classes. And the question that comes to my mind over all of this is, why would the Federalists do that? And the answer is because they knew they couldn't get away with creating an actual aristocracy modeled on, say, the British Empire's aristocracy. They couldn't make it a bloodline aristocracy. Matter of fact, they discussed it. They said, we don't really have anybody who qualifies as a bloodline royalty in a position to take control in the new colonies, in the new states. And so what they did instead is they created an aristocracy of wealth. It's not individuals, it's not specific individuals necessarily who get to be in that aristocracy. It's whoever can take control of enough wealth and power. With the wealth comes the power. Whoever can commandeer the most privileged property, the most wealth, gets to be part of that aristocracy. And so, you know, we see new members of the aristocracy rise regularly. We elect people as president in the United States that they aren't wealthy by any real stretch when they enter office, and when they leave, they are very wealthy. How did that happen? How did that happen? Well, legally, completely legally. But now they're invited to all of the, the big meetings, the secret meetings, and the rest of it. They're part of the club. It's an aristocracy that's not based on merit. It's not based on bloodline. It's based on accumulation of wealth. And rewarding the accumulation of wealth, as I've suggested, is how you lay the basic foundations for building an empire. Protect property rights, even if it's not privileged. Protect property rights, but protect wealth more than personal property. Protect huge wealth more than sort of wealth. And that's essentially, it's a formula for building the centralization of power and control and ownership. The enclosures in Europe and England, for instance, were about taking the commons out of the hands of everybody and putting it in the hands of a few barons in exchange for them giving wealth to the king so he could wage war on France or wherever. That's a dynamic that hasn't changed. How do we wage wars in Iraq and Iran, or not Iran yet, but who knows, but wherever? How do we wage wars all over the globe and have 700 military bases around the globe? How do we do that when the accumulation of wealth is really the purpose? And the answer is that's funded. That's certainly going to be a priority of the U.S. government because it serves the expansion of profit making around the globe. It's not just because we like guns, it's because we like control. And we like to take wealth and especially labor. We like to take the labor of other people and put the value of it into fewer and fewer hands. And that's what I mean by privileged property as well. So, yes, such a rabbit hole. David, yeah, so thank you. We'll wrap it up here. Listen, we're going to put the recording of this session online as soon as we can. You are invited to join us on June 13th for our next gathering. We'll pick up where we left off. There's not an awful lot left in chapter 1, and then we'll move into chapter 2. So chapter 2, we will get into, and the title for chapter 2, if I can make my fingers catch it, the ongoing counter-revolution, because my contention is that the US Constitution was an act of counter-revolution. And so we'll talk about the ongoing counter-revolution against the ideals of Tom Paine and Sam Adams and people like that. Anything else that I forget, Michelle?
I don't believe so. I included some instructions in the chat for people to be able to find the videos. And they can also be searched, on the CELDF website. So I think you covered it.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. And thanks for your comments and questions. And next time around, we'll probably do it similarly. I'm going to play around with it and try to get it better and better, but I really do want you to participate. Read section 3. Oh, and sections 1 and 2. Read section 3 for the next. Thanks. And good night.